When Elias found her by the well, he didn't know she was running from a monster, or that saving her would cost him his peace and heal his soul. The heat of the day had settled deep into the bones of the cabin, a dry, baked warmth that smelled of pine wood and dust. Elias moved through it with a familiar economy, his footsteps sure on the worn floorboards. Outside, the sun was a merciless eye in a bleached blue sky, beating down on the parched earth of his small ranch. He had spent the afternoon mending a stretch of fence at the far edge of his property, the rhythmic strike of his hammer the only sound to break the immense, buzzing silence. Now, back in the quiet dimness of his home, the silence was of a different quality, denser, heavier. It was the silence of a life lived alone. He drew a bucket of water from the well, the rope whispering against the wood, and the coolness of it on his hands was a brief mercy. He drank deeply from the dipper, the water tasting of stone and solitude. His table was set for one, a single plate, a single fork. His bed, visible in the adjoining room, was made for one, the quilt pulled taut over a mattress that held the shape of him and no other. He lit a low lamp as dusk began to bleed across the horizon, the flame casting a small, lonely pool of gold in the growing dark. It was a life of clean lines and quiet purpose, a fortress built of routine. But fortresses, he knew, are made to keep things out, and sometimes they became prisons. The latch on his door was simple, unoiled. He had never had reason to lock it. He found her by the well as the last light of day was failing, a slim shadow that seemed to have materialized from the dust itself. She was on her knees, her head bowed as if in prayer or exhaustion, one hand braced against the cool stones. For a long moment, Elias did not move, his body tensing in the way it did when a coyote circled the chickens, a quiet, ingrained readiness. He was a man who scanned for threats, whose gaze was always fixed on the horizon, but she was not a threat. Her shoulders trembled with a fatigue so profound it seemed to pull her toward the center of the earth. He saw the fine dust caked on her dark dress, the desperate way her fingers clung to the well, as if it were the last solid thing in a collapsing world. He approached slowly, his boots scuffing softly in the dirt, a sound he made deliberately so as not to startle her. She looked up, and in the faint glow from his cabin window, he saw her face. She was younger than he'd thought, her eyes wide and haunted, but holding a fierce, resilient pride. There were bruises on her cheek, faint but undeniable, a story he didn't need to hear to understand. He stopped a few feet from her, leaving a buffer of air between them, a gesture of respect. He didn't ask her name or her business. He simply noted the darkening sky, the way the air had begun to still and thicken with the promise of a summer storm. "There's weather coming in," he said, his voice rough from disuse. He held out a hand, not to touch her, but as an offering. "You're welcome to shelter." She watched him for a long, silent beat, her gaze searching his face for the things men so often hid. Whatever she saw, there seemed to be enough. She gave a slow, tired nod, and with a strength he could see cost her dearly, she pulled herself to her feet. The cabin behind him, with its single lamp burning, was no longer just his refuge. It was now hers as well. The thin walls would have to hold them both. The storm broke just after he'd closed the door, a sudden, violent deluge that washed the world clean. Inside, the sound of the rain was a steady drumming on the roof, a constant reminder of the world held at bay. For 2 days, it rained, turning the hard-baked earth to a thick, impassable mud. And in that time, the cabin became their universe. A quiet rhythm established itself between them, built not on words, but on shared tasks. Her name, he learned, was Elara. She spoke it softly on the first morning, her voice still hoarse with thirst. He nodded, accepting it as a gift. He gave her his name in return. He ceded the small bedroom to her without discussion, taking a blanket to the floor by the hearth. In the mornings, he would rise before her, stoking the fire and putting coffee on to boil. When she emerged, a cup would be waiting on the table. She began to help, at first with hesitant gestures, then with a growing confidence. She shelled peas with him at the small kitchen table, the only sound the soft thump of the pods dropping into a ceramic bowl. Her hands, he noticed, were deft and sure, though they trembled slightly when she thought he wasn't looking. He showed her the workings of the wood stove, the particular way the damper had to be angled to keep an even heat. She, in turn, found a quiet order in his sparsely filled cupboards, arranging the tins of beans and flour into neat rows. The silence that had once been a mark of his solitude was now a shared space, filled with the small sounds of domestic life. The clink of a spoon against a mug, the soft sweep of a broom, the gentle sizzle of bacon in a pan. One afternoon, as the rain softened to a drizzle, she sat by the fire, mending one of his work shirts where the elbow had worn through. He watched her from the other side of the room, pretending to sharpen a knife. He watched the careful, precise movements of her needle, the way her brow furrowed in concentration. She was bringing a quiet beauty to a simple act of repair, and an unfamiliar ache loomed in his chest, a longing so deep it felt like a memory. The cabin no longer felt empty. It felt full. Trust was built in the spaces between words. It was in the way he left the cabin door ajar to her room at night, a silent signal that she was not trapped. It was in the way she began to hum softly while she worked, a fragile tune that spoke of a spirit not entirely broken. He learned to read the subtle shifts in her posture, the tightening of her jaw that meant a memory had surfaced, the slight softening of her eyes when the coffee was just right. He never pushed, never asked about the bruises that were slowly fading from her skin, or the past she had so clearly fled. He simply created a space for her to be, a quiet haven of safety and respect. One evening he was cleaning his rifle, the lamplight glinting off the polished wood and blued steel. It was a tool of his life, a necessity, but he knew how it might look to her. He worked with methodical care, his large hands surprisingly gentle with the intricate mechanism. When he was finished, he reassembled it and stood to place it back on the rack above the mantel. He paused, then turned to her where she sat reading a worn book he'd had for years. He held the rifle out to her, butt first, his hand far from the trigger, his gaze steady and clear. It was an offering of peace, a gesture that said, "I am not a threat to you." She looked from the rifle to his face, and a flicker of understanding passed through her eyes. She reached out and her fingers brushed his as she took it, her touch feather light. She held it for a moment, feeling its weight, then carefully placed it on the rack herself. She didn't say thank you, and he didn't need her to. Later that night, as they sat at the table for a supper of stew and fresh bread, she looked across at him. "Elias?" she said, and it was the first time she had spoken his name with such softness, a test and a question all at once. A small, unguarded smile touched her lips, a hesitant dawn after a long night. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. The pulse in his throat hammered, a quiet, insistent drumbeat in the shared silence. The nightmares came on the fourth night. The rain had stopped, and a profound quiet had fallen over the land, broken only by the chirping of crickets. Elias was lying on his bedroll by the dying fire when he heard it, a small, choked cry from the other room. He was instantly awake, his body rigid, every instinct honed for danger. But this was a different kind of threat, one he couldn't face with a rifle or a steady hand. He rose silently, his bare feet making no sound on the floorboards. He stopped at her open doorway, a tall, solid silhouette against the faint moonlight filtering through the window. Her breathing was ragged, caught in the grip of a dream he couldn't see. She whimpered again, a sound of pure terror that sliced through him. He did not rush in. He did not touch her. He stood at the threshold, a guardian at the gate of her fear, and waited. His presence seemed to penetrate her sleep, and she slowly quieted, her thrashing easing. He remained for a long time, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest until he was sure the worst had passed. He was about to turn away when her voice, small and fragile in the darkness, stopped him. "Don't go." He turned back. Her eyes were open, glistening in the moonlight. She was awake. He stepped into the room, his heart a heavy, painful weight in his chest. He saw the vulnerability in her face, the raw terror left behind by the dream, and his protective instinct was a physical force, a current pulling him toward her. Yet he stopped at the foot of her bed, his hands clenched at his sides. He would not assume. He would not take. He asked, his voice a low rumble. "May I?" She gave a single, sharp nod, a release of breath that was all the permission he needed. He moved to the side of the bed and sat on the edge, the mattress dipping with his weight. He did not reach for her, did not try to soothe her with platitudes. He simply sat there, his presence a solid, unwavering anchor in a terrifying dark. After a moment, he slowly reached out and gently took her wrist, his fingers finding the frantic, thrumming pulse. He held it, his thumb stroking the delicate skin, a grounding touch that said, "You are here. You are safe. I am with you." The barrier of polite distance that had existed between them dissolved in that single, chosen moment of closeness. The man arrived in town a week later. His name was Croft, and he carried with him an air of slick, entitled ownership. He rode a fine horse and wore clothes that were too clean for the frontier, his polished boots an insult to the dusty street. Elias heard the talk first at the general store, whispers of a wealthy man from back east looking for his ward, a young woman who had run off. The description was vague, but a cold knot of certainty tightened in Elias's gut. Croft's inquiries soon became more specific, his questions laced with an oily charm that set Elias's teeth on edge. He was a predator, a man who saw the world as a collection of things to be possessed. The town, starved for gossip, began to watch. They saw Elara in the small garden behind Elias's cabin, her hands in the earth. They saw her walking beside him as he checked his fences, her presence a quiet declaration. Tongues wagged. Croft's questions grew more pointed, and soon he knew where to look. He rode out to the ranch one afternoon, reining his horse in at the edge of the property line as if he owned that, too. Elias was splitting wood, the rhythmic swing of the axe a balm to his coiled tension. Elara was on the porch, shelling beans. Croft dismounted, his smile a thin, predatory curve. "There you are, my dear," he said, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "I've been looking all over for you." Elara went still, the bowl in her lap forgotten. The color drained from her face, but her chin lifted, her pride an invisible shield. Elias set the axe down, deliberately, and walked to stand between them. He was not a large man, but he was solid. Rooted to the earth he worked. He didn't speak. He simply stood, a silent, immovable wall. Croft's eyes narrowed, dismissing Elias as a simple obstacle. "This is a private matter," he said, taking a step forward. "Stand aside." Elias didn't move. He looked at Elara, a quick, questioning glance that ceded all power to her. It was her choice. Her voice, when she spoke, was clear and steady, betraying none of the terror he knew she must feel. "I am not going with you, Mr. Croft." Croft's facade of civility cracked. "You belong to me," he snarled. "I have papers." "She is not property," Elias said, his voice dangerously quiet. He took a step forward, and for the first time, Croft seemed to recognize the deep, unyielding strength in the man before him. He backed away, his hand hovering near the pistol at his hip. But he was a coward at his core. He remounted, his face a mask of fury. "This isn't over," he spat, before wheeling his horse around and galloping away, leaving a cloud of dust and impotent rage in his wake. The encounter left a tangible tension in the air, a threat that lingered long after Croft was gone. The silence in the cabin that evening was different, not comfortable, but taut with unspoken fears. They moved around each other with a heightened awareness, the small space seeming to shrink. Finally, as the lamplight cast long shadows on the walls, Elias broke the silence. "He won't take you," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a vow. Elara looked up from the seam she was mending, her needle stilled. "What do we do?" she asked, and the simple word, "we," hung in the air between them, a new and powerful thing. It was the first time she had voiced their shared fate. They talked then, not of the past, but of the present, of Croft, of the town, of the lies he was surely spreading. In the flickering light, with the vast, dark prairie outside, the cabin became a sanctuary, a small island of trust in a sea of uncertainty. Elias found himself speaking of things he hadn't shared with another living soul. He spoke of the profound loneliness that had settled in his bones after his parents died, of the way the silence of the ranch had sometimes felt like a physical weight. "It wasn't quiet in this house until you came," he admitted, his voice low. "It was just empty." She listened, her gaze soft and perceptive. And then she spoke of her own fear, not just of Croft, but of the life he represented, a gilded cage where her dignity was stripped away piece by piece. She didn't offer details of his cruelty, but she didn't have to. The truth of it lived in the guarded set of her shoulders, in the way she still flinched at sudden movements. "Here," she whispered, her eyes meeting his across the small table, "I feel safe." The confession was a fragile bridge between them. He wanted to reach across, to take her hand, to offer a comfort that words could not convey. Instead, he simply nodded, his throat tight. Later, as he banked the fire for the night, he saw she was shivering, though the night was warm. He took the quilt from his own bedroll and gently draped it over her shoulders. "I'll keep you warm," he said, the simple, practical words a promise far deeper than she could know. It was a vow of home, of comfort, of a shared life. It was everything. Croft was not a man to accept defeat. He shifted his attack from overt intimidation to something more insidious. He went to the town sheriff, a man named Miller, who valued order and the path of least resistance. Croft spun a tale of a runaway wife, a hysterical woman prone to fancy, whom he, the concerned husband, was only trying to bring home. He produced documents forgeries, Elara would later confirm, that seemed to lend his story the weight of law. Miller, swayed by Croft's wealth and apparent civility, rode out to the ranch 2 days later, his badge a dull star on his chest. He found Elias and Elara weeding the garden, their heads bent together in the morning sun. Miller was not an unkind man, but he was a cautious one. "Elias," he said, his voice heavy with reluctance, "Mr. Croft has filed a claim. Says this woman is his wife." Elias straightened slowly, wiping the dirt from his hands onto his trousers. He felt Elara tense beside him. He placed a hand on the small of her back, a brief, reassuring touch. "He's lying," Elias said, his voice flat and even. "This is Miss Elara Vance. She is my guest." Miller sighed, looking from Elias's resolute face to Elara's proud, frightened one. "He has papers, Elias. Says he just wants to take her home, that he'll forgive her foolishness." It was Elara who answered. She stepped forward, out from behind the shield of Elias's body, and faced the sheriff directly. Her voice did not tremble. "That man is not my husband. This is my home." She spoke the words with a simple, unshakable conviction that gave Miller pause. He looked at the two of them, the quiet, capable rancher and the resilient young woman who stood beside him not as a possession, but as a partner. He saw the way Elias's gaze rested on her, a look of profound respect and devotion. He saw the shared strength that flowed between them. He had known Elias for years, knew him to be an honest, solitary man, and he had seen the predatory glint in Croft's eyes. "My apologies for disturbing you, Miss Vance," Miller said, tipping his hat. He turned his horse. "Elias," He rode away, leaving the two of them standing together in the quiet garden, a united front against the world. The town was watching, and they had made their choice clear. The final confrontation came at dusk. Croft, enraged by the sheriff's refusal to act, took matters into his own hands. He rode to the ranch not alone, but with two hired men, rough-looking drifters he'd found in a saloon. They were a physical threat, a blunt instrument of his will. Elias saw them coming from a distance, 3 riders dark against the setting sun. He sent Elara inside, his voice cold but firm. Bolt the door. Stay away from the windows. He didn't reach for his rifle. He walked to the center of the yard and waited, his feet planted firmly on his land. He would not turn his home into a battlefield. Croft and his men dismounted, spreading out to flank him. "This is your last chance, rancher," Croft sneered, his face flushed with anger. "Give me the girl, and I'll let you keep your miserable patch of dirt." Elias's gaze was steady. "Her name is Elara, and she is not yours to take." Just then, the cabin door creaked open. Elara stepped out onto the porch, her face pale but resolute. She held Elias's heavy rifle in her hands. She did not point it. She held it across her body, a symbol of her refusal to be a victim. Croft's eyes lit up with a sick possessiveness. "There you are, my dear. Put that foolish thing down and come with me." Elias never took his eyes off Croft, but he spoke to her. "Elara, go back inside." "No," she said, her voice ringing with newfound strength. She looked past him, her gaze fixed on the man who had tormented her. She took a step forward, her dignity her only weapon. "You have no power here, Mr. Croft. You have no claim on me. I am not your property." She then turned her head, her eyes finding Elias's. The world seemed to narrow, the 2 hired guns and the sneering man fading into the periphery. There was a silent question in her eyes, an offering. The invitation to stay, once his to give, was now hers. "I'm staying," she said, her voice soft but unwavering, a vow spoken just for him. The fight went out of Elias, replaced by a profound, grounding peace. He met her gaze, and in it he saw his future. He turned back to Croft, his expression unreadable. "You heard her," he said. "This is her home." Croft stared, his face contorting in disbelief and fury. He saw the truth then. He had not been beaten by the quiet rancher. He had been beaten by the woman he thought he owned. With a frustrated roar, he and his men mounted their horses and rode away for the last time, swallowed by the encroaching darkness. In the aftermath, a deep, resonant quiet settled over the ranch. The thud of the departing horses' hooves faded, leaving only the sound of the wind sighing through the tall grass. The threat was gone, but its echo remained in the tense set of their shoulders, the adrenaline still singing in their veins. Elias turned and walked to the porch, his body feeling immensely heavy. Elara hadn't moved. The rifle was a dead weight in her arms. He gently took it from her, his fingers brushing hers, and leaned it against the cabin wall. He didn't speak. He simply stood with her, watching the last sliver of sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange. The silence was different now. It was not empty, not tense, but full of all the things that had just happened, and all the things that were about to. He went inside and stoked the fire, its warm glow pushing back the shadows. He put the kettle on, the familiar domestic act, a comfort in the charged atmosphere. When he brought her a cup of strong, sweet tea, he found her sitting at the table, her hands clasped before her. He set the mug down and, without thinking, reached out and laid his hand over hers. Her skin was cold. He simply held them, his warmth seeping into hers, a silent offering of aftercare. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and luminous in the lamplight, and a slow, genuine smile spread across her face. It was the first time he had seen her smile without a shadow of fear behind it, an unguarded expression of pure relief. The sight of it cracked something open in his chest. He felt his own lips curve in response, a mirroring of her joy. The tension of the past weeks finally broke, not with a storm, but with a quiet, shared dawn. The air in the cabin was light, breathable. They were safe. They were home. The days that followed took on a new rhythm, one of grace and ease. The unspoken questions that had hung between them now had answers. There was no discussion of her leaving. It was simply understood that this was her place now, as much as it was his. The cot he had used by the fire was put away, and the single bed in the bedroom was now theirs. The first night, he had hesitated at the door, his old habit of giving her space dying hard. She had simply taken his hand and led him inside, an invitation given with quiet autonomy. Their intimacy was a landscape they explored with careful, consensual steps, a tenderness that was more profound than passion. It was in the way he would wake in the night and pull the blanket higher over her shoulder, the way her hand would find his in the dark. Their love was shown in small, repeated acts. He began to repair an old rocking chair that had belonged to his mother, sanding the wood smooth, his calloused hands surprisingly gentle. It was a gift for her, a place for her to sit and watch the sunset. She, in turn, began to fill the cabin with small touches of life, a jar of wildflowers on the table, curtains mended and hung in the window, the scent of fresh herbs drying from the rafters. She was not just occupying the space. She was making it a home. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch, a comfortable silence between them, he pressed a small object into her palm. It was a bird, carved from a piece of scrap pine, its lines simple but full of life. He had worked on it in secret moments, whittling away until the shape of it felt right. She closed her fingers around it, the smooth wood warm against her skin. It was more than a gift. It was a token of his devotion, a piece of his heart made tangible. They were two solitary people who had found in each other a shared world. The two mugs on the shelf, the two sets of footprints leading from the door, the quiet hum of two lives intertwined. It was a testament to a love built not on grand declarations, but on the steady foundation of daily life. The future was not a grand destination they spoke of, but a path they began to walk together, day by day. They stood on the porch one evening, the summer heat finally breaking, a cool breeze whispering of the coming autumn. Elias's arm was settled around her waist, a familiar, comforting weight. She leaned against his side, her head resting on his shoulder, as they watched the sky fade from gold to indigo. They didn't speak of marriage vows or ceremonies. Their promises were quieter, woven into the fabric of their plans. "The roof on the barn will need mending before the first rains," he said, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "We should clear that back patch next spring," she replied, her voice soft. "It would get good sun for tomatoes. We, us, our." The words were the foundation stones of their future, laid with care and quiet certainty. He had spent a lifetime scanning the horizon for threats, his gaze always outward. Now he found his focus had shifted. He found himself reading the landscape of her face, the subtle shifts of emotion in her eyes, the gentle curve of her smile. She had survived, and in doing so, had taught him how to truly live. He had been her protector, but she had been his salvation, healing a part of his soul he hadn't even known was broken. He tightened his arm around her, drawing her closer. The house behind them, once a bastion of his solitude, was now a shared sanctuary, its walls holding the warmth of their shared life. There was no need for grand pronouncements. Their vow was in the steady beat of his heart against her back, in the shared breath they took as the first star appeared in the evening sky. It was a quiet promise of a future, sealed not with a kiss, but with the simple, profound peace of finally being home.